So our next speaker then is Maria Ryan. Maria has over 20 years experience lecturing on a variety of academic programs from level 6 to level 9, including initial teacher education, business studies and hospitality management programs. Her research interests include mathematics anxiety amongst mature students in higher education, the adult learner in higher education, exploring the flipped classroom, alternative assessment for service, mathematics and business modules, and she's an action research supervisor on the professional diploma in mathematics for teachers. Her subject expertise includes service mathematics, management, information systems. Okay, over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thanks for having me here today, and good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here and lovely to share my research. I focus my PhD research on the topic of maths anxiety, particularly among mature students, because I find from teaching maths, and I teach business maths, have been for the last 15 years or so, when I start teaching that module every September, without fail, mature students especially will come to me and share their stories of usually bad experiences of doing mathematics. And clearly, by engaging with them, by hearing their stories, they have maths anxiety. So that prompted me to do my research for my PhD and to continue that research, and I'll mention that as I go through my talk. The premise for my presentation today, I suppose we're very much aware of hearing about the need for knowledge-informed citizens, for changing labour markets and globalisation. And as a result of that discourse, many of our programmes in higher education have included what we call service maths modules and have done for many years now. And sometimes those service maths modules, and I'll talk about the explanation of that in a while, but maths, where maths is not the main specialty of the programme, but it's a module nonetheless that students must do. Usually it's mandatory. And that often comes as a surprise to some students, and particularly if they're not prepared for that. So there's kind of a number of themes running through my presentation, including the looking at support for students and maths anxiety itself, and some of the, I suppose, we might say the causes or the sources. It's difficult to identify just one, so I'll present a backdrop to that as well. So in particular, focusing on awareness of maths anxiety, the impact of it, and looking at ways to detect it. Then the support theme, and also running through my research is the significance of a person's maths story. And that stems from my research and listening to students talking about their experiences with maths. So Flavia touched on it earlier about the prevalence of maths anxiety, and I think I've captured it here as being prevalent and problematic. It's prevalent because, as we know, and Flavia also mentioned this, it is present in students at all levels of maths in education. Indeed, some research will say there is no maths anxiety until students start school. So we're talking about preschool even, where maths anxiety has been detected in recent research. It's also across disciplines. So while we might think that there's a prevalence for students in STEM disciplines to be more adept with maths, even students doing STEM disciplines do have some maths anxiety, but particular disciplines like education as well, particularly initial teacher education for primary school level, there is a prevalence of higher levels of maths anxiety there as well. And also the national and international discourse on mathematics. For example, here in Ireland, every August, with the release of state examination results, the focus is always on mathematics, primarily, on how many people got H1s in the higher paper, how many people failed, and it's a big talking point. So there's much discussion about maths, and as we all hear as well, and any of us who are involved in this research, we know that people are very free to say, I'm no good at maths, but they're not as free to say it in terms of, I'm no good at reading or writing. So there's a particular discourse around negativity towards mathematics. Maths anxiety is problematic, and again, I'm not repeating Flavia, but it touches on what Flavia presented earlier. It affects student engagement with maths, and that's really coming through in the talks today. And there's a negative correlation with performance in mathematics as well. In particular, it impedes motivation. So the downside of maths anxiety, where it's at an elevated level, is it affects students' motivation around maths in terms of maybe doing higher levels of mathematics, doing additional modules and so on. And it also impacts on their self-confidence. And worst case scenario, at high levels of mathematics anxiety, it leads to maths avoidance, where students will go out of their way to avoid having anything to do with mathematics. And that's hugely problematic if we are to develop the knowledge-informed citizens that we're expected to have in society nowadays. So service mathematics, as it's defined there by Gill and O'Donoghue, is where mathematics is a component of study, but it's not the main discipline of study. So for example, the service maths module I'm teaching at the moment is business mathematics, and my students are doing an initial teacher education program for secondary level, and they're chosen business as one of their subjects. So these modules are mandatory in many undergraduate programs. And as I mentioned as well, they can come as a surprise to some students where they may not be aware of the service maths modules. And in that regard, sometimes the maths modules themselves, service maths modules, they don't have the word mathematics in the title, which can be deceiving. And that's not intentional, but it's just students don't see the word mathematics. For example, quantitative analysis, for example, is one, and they may not initially perceive that as being a mathematics-loaded module. So if we were to say what causes maths anxiety, it's probably better to look at what leads to a maths anxiety reaction. We can very easily blame teachers and blame topics within maths, but it really is a combination of factors. It's a complex construct. And in particular, maths anxiety is a build-up of factors from the learner's previous experiences, particularly in the school context, and also in the home with parent and parental influence. Also their disposition themselves, how they are as a learner of mathematics. Are they nervous about maths? Their own self-esteem, self-efficacy around mathematics. Have they got a tendency to avoid maths as well? So how they are as a person, as a learner. And that is influenced by their previous experiences. And altogether, that then can be triggered by something in the context for doing mathematics. So maybe it's the nature of the topic they're doing. Typically the likes of fractions, long division, algebra, maybe certain aspects of calculus. Some of those all feature highly as immediate triggers for the maths anxious reaction. The scheduling of classes, for example, even in a higher education context, sometimes classes might be double lectures, 2 hours long, maybe 3 hours long. And for a maths anxious person, that can be extremely off-putting because there's no chance to take a breather there and to reflect on the concepts. So they can just switch off completely. In any other context with timetabling where classes are distant from each other, so a few days or even a week apart, that can also be challenging because it breaks the momentum in terms of studying the topic and so on. So that combination of factors leads to the maths anxiety reaction. Detecting maths anxiety. So how do you know a student has maths anxiety? They're generally not going to walk up to you and say, I've got maths anxiety. But through what they talk to you about, their anecdotes, their stories, you will get a sense for how they feel about mathematics. And you might even notice their body reactions when they're talking to you about maths. That nervousness that Flavia mentioned earlier, that can come through visually. You can see that they are nervous about mathematics. A very useful tool in helping on a one-to-one basis with the student is to get them to draw their timeline with mathematics. And in that, you can get them to pinpoint particular moments of their timeline that might have caused an anxious reaction around mathematics. And that can be something that can be drawn, or you can use, for example, an Excel spreadsheet graph to do a timeline as well. A maths anxiety questionnaire, so the one I use with my students and I have used in my research, is Thomas Hunt's Maths Anxiety Scale UK version. And again, that's made up of 3 different subscales, which looks at maths evaluation, it looks at maths in everyday contexts, and maths observation as well. And from my own research, I uncovered that it's much better to look at the results of the Maths Anxiety Scale UK in its separate subscales, because the subscale findings separately tell you a lot more about the level of anxiety that the student has, that it's more evaluation related or lesser so everyday situations. And the Maths Life Story as well. This is something that I developed through my own research in allowing students to talk about their experiences. So it's based on life story research, particularly by Dan McAdams in the US. And it's looking at periods of time in a student's life where they would have engaged with mathematics. So starting with their earliest memory, which usually is the primary school context, and building on that, looking at the secondary school context. If they're mature students, they will likely have experience outside of school, maybe in a work environment that is also relevant to maybe engaging with numbers in a practical sense. And also their life story as students at undergraduate level will look at their decision to maybe enter higher education and if maths played a role in that decision. In some cases, and I suppose those of us that have students in our maths classes, they're the lucky ones because they've come in the door. But there are many others that do not engage with higher education or even further education because of the maths content. And they're also a body that we need to capture in terms of research and helping them and supporting them as well. So the Maths Life Story was a very beneficial tool in my own research in terms of identifying the points along the way that were particularly causing anxiety or leading to heightened anxiety for students of mathematics. What I have here is a contrast of students with low maths anxiety and high maths anxiety. And it's interesting that they're like polar opposites in a way. So in terms of learning maths, low maths anxious students, they're generally very proactive about learning maths. They're keen to understand the concepts. They see relevance. They're well prepared for classes and exams. And they are very proactive about seeking support. If I flip across to the high maths anxious students, then by contrast, they generally have trouble grasping maths concepts. They resort to rote learning very much so, and following procedures rather than understanding concepts. They just want to get it done, so they'll follow a pattern that they're familiar with, that they're comfortable with. They cannot think outside the box then when it comes to applying that knowledge of maths. They will really focus on just whatever it takes to get a pass in their exams. That's all they want, is to pass the line and be finished with their service maths module. And they're less likely to seek support, and that's problematic. They feel they will ask stupid questions. They feel they will look stupid to whoever is the tutor in the maths support centre, for example, and they tend to avoid maths support, formal maths support in that regard. And that's hugely problematic for highly maths anxious students because they're the ones that really need the support. Coming back to my left-hand side then, the low maths anxious students generally have good self-concept in maths. They feel they can do it, contrasting with the poor self-concept for highly maths anxious students. Low maths anxious students are able to move on from a past negative experience. They can get over it. They can address what needs to be done and move on. That's a difficulty for people with high maths anxiety. In the stories of people with low maths anxiety, they will have had support in the home environment from parents and teachers. They talk about the good teachers, as they call them, who really went out of their way to help them. Whereas in contrast, highly maths anxious students, in their histories, they generally have had little or no support from parents or teachers. And finally then, low maths anxious students are comfortable using calculations or numbers in an everyday or work context. Whereas on the other side, highly maths anxious students tend to avoid everyday or work contexts involving calculations or numbers. And again, that's problematic when you think of the premise I started out with and the need for knowledge-informed citizens, which is underpinned by competency in skills like mathematics. And very importantly, on the right-hand side, for a highly maths anxious student, they may also have a learning difficulty or a specific maths learning difficulty like dyscalculia. And I know Cathal a while ago talked about dyslexia and the prevalence of that, but the prevalence of dyscalculia is almost up on a par with dyslexia, so it really needs to be addressed, particularly in research circles. So in terms of supporting students in higher education with maths, it's important that we make sure students are aware of the maths support that's available at their higher education institution. Of the students I researched who were all in higher education institutions in Ireland, 25% of them were not aware that there was any form of maths support in their educational institution. And that group of students were from the one higher education institution in Ireland. So again, where one institution, the students there was quite a lot of them, they felt that they had no awareness that there was actually maths support available to them. The communication around the supports needs to be very much to the fore when students are even applying for a programme, let alone when they come in the door. Typically how maths support is offered, and there's a variety of ways in which students are supported, both before and during their studies. So mature students especially are often offered preparatory courses or access courses, they might also be called, to bridge the gap from when they would have last done maths to where they need to be now as they start their undergraduate programme. Many colleges, I know UCD is one of them, have dedicated maths support centres, whereas some other colleges have a range of academic supports, and maths is one of those supports, so a different approach there as well in some colleges. Tutorials are often timetabled, particularly for support with mathematics. Many lecturers and tutors are very open to letting students come and talk to them, and again, mature students especially feel that's very important, that they can talk to their lecturers about their issues with mathematics and particularly anxiety. Online resources, again, which have really increased in recent years, peer support as well, and private tuition, of course, which requires payment, and particularly outside of the educational environment. So in particular, I've singled out here a point on highly maths anxious students. They often avoid maths support. I touched on that already, again, in terms of asking irrelevant questions or the fear of being perceived as stupid. And this is even more so among mature students because of the distance from when they were last in an educational environment to where they are now as they pursue their higher education studies. And with mature students as well, for many of them, this is their last chance to upskill. They really they're motivated to do this course that they've enrolled for, so they really need all the supports they can get to get through their course. So there's a kind of a really strong motivation there for mature students doing an undergrad programme. So in terms of supporting the maths anxious students, what I recommend is, and I've done this myself, and it came through in my research, is that the lecturer or tutor reflect on their own experiences with mathematics. So for me, that meant going back to my school days, thinking about those moments that were maybe negative, but also the positives, and what were those? And it helps you to empathise with your students as well. So reflect on your own maths life story. And as well as that then, find out how maths anxious the students are. Be open to them, do a maths anxiety scale test if you wish. Invite them to come and talk to you as well as your lecturer about how maths anxious they are. Some considerations for teaching maths as well, about the messages we can convey as teachers of maths. I know up to recently I might have said something like, oh, this is easy. It's easy for me to say that, but it may not be easy for the people in my cohort in front of me. So how we describe things and how we characterise things, we have to be very careful, because what might be easy to us may not be, and may be very distant from that feeling for some in the class. How you start and end your class as well, in terms of maybe summarising things and so on. Encouraging collaborative activities in class, again, to allow for maybe different abilities to mix together, talking to each other, the use of visuals and so on to suit the different learning needs. So building on what Julie and Fiona talked earlier with bringing in the different methods for universal design for learning. Encouraging discussion around mistakes, because often mistakes are seen as, that's not right, this is how you do it. But the mistakes are what show us where we learn from. And engagement with maths class. So how do your students engage? If you do take attendance registers, for example, are you noticing that certain students are avoiding your maths classes, and why might that be? That might be a trigger for you then to follow up and see how they're doing. And these are just a few summarised there in terms of teaching maths. In terms of understanding and empathy, so I mentioned about particularly mature students, the significance of maths to the student. And if it's a mature student, they need to do the degree, it might be a last chance for them. So they're really invested in getting on well and knowing the material. And also, what is the student's motivation for learning this maths module? Is it part of the degree? They have to do it, it's mandatory. Or if it's not a mandatory module, if it's something they've chosen to do, and so on. That might often determine how they engage with maths. With regard to support and guidance, it's so important to start with where the student is at. And again, that brings in the UDL techniques as well there in consideration. And as well as that, space to allow students to share their experiences of doing mathematics. And one thing that's come to light in this for me as well is, while you encourage students to talk about their experiences, it might be easier to do that over a cup of coffee in a canteen rather than in a classroom or in a maths support centre, because the very thought maybe of the classroom, the maths support centre, particularly for a highly maths anxious student, might be completely off-putting. So a more relaxed environment and letting the student have a chance to talk with you in a non-judgmental, non-evaluative situation will be really helpful. Some strategies, and there's a long list obviously, but I've just picked out a few. Again, the focus on mistakes, I've touched on that. The development of a stuck sheet, which is, I think, a great tool to help students identify what can help them become unstuck with mathematics. And I'll show a sample of that in a moment. Reading about how others feel about mathematics, a technique known as bibliotherapy, which is really interesting, and it seems to work, particularly for highly anxious students, because they know they're not alone. And also writing about your feelings before a test, maybe half an hour before you sit a maths test, just writing down how you're feeling at that time and reflecting on it. Breathing and exercise as well as proven anxiety techniques, and there are many more. I know in a while Sue is going to talk about the mathematical resilience framework, and that's a really good tool, so I won't spoil that on you, Sue. I'll let you continue talking about that later. From my own experience with using the life story, a very simple approach to that is where you tell the students, identify a significant maths moment in your life, write a few lines about it, and share it with the person beside you. Now, I've put optional there because depending on the story, they may not want to share it, but they might write it down and maybe hand it up to you or talk to you about it on a one-to-one. But that's a simple way of approaching the maths life story, because there's always one moment that stands out for all of us. And I think it's fair to say that if I asked any of you, what is that maths moment? There's always one that comes to mind. The stuck sheet is very simply a list of ideas to help the student become unstuck. And it's just a list. There's no real guidelines on this. It's just things that can help you become unstuck. Ask the teacher, ask a friend, read the question carefully, look at yours. They're all practical tips. And even the reaffirmation at the end, don't give up, keep on going, something like that. And the idea is that the student will have something like this. It could be an A4 sheet, maybe laminated in their folders. It could be on the wall of a classroom. But it's to remind students that there is help and they can become unstuck as well. So some final thoughts there. So the significance of mathematics, it's a gatekeeper status for many students as well. How they perform in maths determines where they go after that. Service maths as well. Students need to be informed about the presence of service maths in their courses and be prepared for those modules. Maths supports then are significant in that regard. So it's important to address maths anxiety to avoid what we might consider as long-term adverse cyclical consequences. And I think at the start of Flavia's talk, she talked about the impact of the parent and the children of today going on to be the parents and teachers of tomorrow. And if maths anxiety is not addressed, the cycle continues. So screening for maths anxiety and maths learning difficulties is very important. And the significance of previous maths experience, students need to be able to air those and to be able to share them with their lecturers or teachers as well, because negative experience will impact on maths confidence. And as well as that, I recommend allowing space to talk about maths experiences. So with that, I just leave a list of some resources there to do with the higher education context. There's a variety of materials there, and I'm happy to share those in the slide presentation as well. Thank you very much indeed. And some references, and thank you.
Thanks so much,
No
Maria.
bother. Thanks, Anthony.
Talk. Any questions or comments for Maria? Yes?
Thank you very much, Maria. That was excellent.
Thank you, you're welcome.
Is there a relationship between maths anxiety and the type of supports that students engage in?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer straight off, but I do know the one-to-one support is hugely effective for students with higher levels of maths anxiety. So that one-to-one support where they can just meet with one person. In terms of maths support, where there's a maths support centre, for example, a highly maths anxious person may not go in if there's a crowd there. So I don't know if even arranging an appointment would help. It's probably better that the student can be targeted on a one-to-one basis, and that needs to be promoted, I think, as well. So that's one thing I know that has come up in my own research, is that the importance of one-to-one is very helpful in just that initial step of going about getting support. Even if it's just a chat on the first occasion and nothing about maths, just getting in the door and making that acquaintance is very important. So gently approach, I would say.
Thanks, Maria. A lot of your work actually motivated me in my own research. So you did obviously the mature student in higher education. So I focused on mature students in further education.
Yes.
And one of the things that resonated was the specific moments that learners drawn. And for me, in my own research, a lot of it was stuff like having to recite tables in front of the class. But in other instances, like the junior certificate and leaving certificate, like.
Yeah.
So from my own experience like that, it's just very, I suppose, very familiar with what you've done. Like, I mean, and it's very interesting to draw on that. Like.
Yes.
So, and I suppose the discourse now around the leaving certificate is very pertinent at the moment.
Yes.
Because it's up for reform, and it's just interesting to see how we can pan out, like, you know, particularly
Absolutely.
the implications for maths anxiety for adult learners. Like.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks,
Thank
Adrian. Just one more, Anthony, and we might have to call a halt then. We've a Zoom question as well, have we? Thanks, Claire.
So I've been teaching a service module in the Moods for engineering maths students, and we've got 2 cohorts coming in. One that requires a H4 in maths, and one that requires a H7.
Okay.
And they always, like you were saying, they come in and say, we didn't realise we have to do enough maths. Do you think, A, there's an onus on the actual departments and the admissions office and universities to make it much more clear that they have to do maths? And would you find there might be a conscious effort on the part of departments getting us to do student or service teaching to play down the amount of maths to increase their FTEs and student numbers?
I suppose if you'd asked me this maybe 10 years ago, I'd have said no, that the students should research their programmes and know exactly what's coming up. But I think the more you publicise what's in the course, I think that's going to benefit everybody. And you might find that causes students to be more prepared for their maths modules before they enter the programme. Sorry, the second part of your question.
Is there an onus on the actual departments and the admissions offices to make it crystal clear exactly how much maths is in it? And do you find it deliberately playing down the maths to increase the student numbers? Because maths anxiety might make them not apply for the course.
Yeah, I think it's problematic talking about maths anxiety, and I suppose talking down is probably one way of describing it. But I think, yes, you have to make it appealing, and on the one hand, you have to let them know there is a lot of work involved, but maybe making the maths content more relevant using examples to everyday contexts that might help the appeal of the subject, and in turn entice them to study it, but also in the same token ensuring that they know the supports are there to help them through. And what I found in my own research as well is mature students tend to engage with maths support all through the semester, whereas our what we call traditional students coming in from leaving certs, they tend to engage close to exam or assessment time. So that's another problem. There should be more consistent engagement with the support services. And I suppose incorporating the likes of the UDL approach to maths support, there are different ways then of targeting different maybe groups within cohorts in terms of helping them with maths. So I hope that's in some way addressed your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I agree with everything you say, and once you get students in the door, it's easy, relatively easy to work with them. Do you have any secrets for getting them through the door, for getting past that, getting the information out? I had a student doing business statistics for the 3rd time this year who finally came to maths support and said until now he wasn't aware that there was any maths support, and yet we advertise with him fairly well. So do you have any tips?
I know one thing that's effective, and we do it ourselves at Mary Immaculate College, is we have student-teacher experience days where potential or prospective students get to come on campus maybe 6 months before they would start the programme, and they get a chance to experience what it would be like. So we make it very clear to them at those events what's involved in the programme, the different subjects they'll be dealing with and so on. And I suppose even the prospectus material that's issued to prospective students or through career guidance counsellors in schools, that can also maybe be more explicitly stating what's involved. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, just on that, we ran a programme for about 5 years with my colleague Evie Hulawan. It was Math Sparks, where we invited DESH kids. So there were secondary school kids that were mostly transition year and 5th year, and we brought them to the university and we health stuff in science, and since we've had them in the Maths Support Centre. And then if they do come to university, they'll often say, oh, you're the maths guy.
Yes.
And they'll associate me with the centre, and they're more likely then to come to the centre, but having the outreach before they came to university. Now, we didn't know they were going to come to our university, of course, but it was just the outreach kind of broke that barrier a little
absolutely.
bit, which is similar to what
it's
you're
a great
saying.
technique as well, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we might move on. Thanks again, Maria, for that.
Thank you very much indeed.